The smoke in the cantina was so thick you could cut it with a plasma blade. Nexus Station's entertainment district never slept, and neither did the bar that served as home to every broken soul drifting through the outer rim. The air reeked of burnt fuel, alien sweat, and regret. In the farthest corner, where the lighting barely reached, sat a figure that made even hardened smugglers give him space. Vextar had been nursing the same bottle of Rigelian fire whiskey for 3 hours, watching. The amber liquid swirled like liquid stars. His purple scales, once vibrant and proud, now bore the dull sheen of too many battles. Scars crisscrossed his massive frame like a roadmap of pain, each one telling a story he wished he could forget. The Zolothian's 6 eyes moved independently, a trait that had saved his life countless times in combat. Tonight, they all focused on the same thing, the bottom of his glass, as if the answers to his nightmares lay hidden in the dregs of alien alcohol. Heavy footsteps echoed across the metal floor, cutting through the usual cantina noise of gambling, arguing, and the occasional blaster being drawn. Vextar didn't look up. He'd heard those particular footsteps before, young, confident, untested. Military boots on someone who'd never had to scrape his friend's blood off his armor. Commander Vextar? The voice belonged to someone barely out of training. Fresh-faced, probably still believed in the glory of serving the Galactic Coalition. Poor kid had no idea what real war looked like. Vextar's primary eyes shifted upward without moving his head. Standing before him was a young officer, maybe 25 standard years, with the kind of clean uniform that screamed desk duty. His species markings suggested he was from one of the core worlds, places where war was something that happened to other people, in other systems. "I'm Lieutenant Kylo from the Coalition Intelligence Division," the young officer continued, his voice gaining a slight tremor despite his attempts to sound official. "I've been assigned to document first-hand accounts of the human integration wars. Your service record shows you were present at several major engagements, and I was hoping you could share some of your experiences." Vextar let out a sound somewhere between a laugh and a growl. His scarred hide rippled as he finally lifted. His massive head, all 6 eyes now focused on the lieutenant, with an intensity that made the young officer take a step back. "Sit down, whelp." The words came out like gravel being crushed under a starship's landing gear. Around them, conversations died as other patrons sensed the shift in atmosphere. Even the bartender, a 4-armed Krillian who'd seen everything the galaxy had to offer, found something very interesting to clean at the far end of the bar. The lieutenant hesitated, then pulled out the chair across from Vextar. The metal groaned under his weight as he sat, trying to maintain some semblance of official composure. "You want to hear about humans?" Vextar's voice carried across the suddenly quiet cantina like a death sentence. "Fine, but don't expect tales. Have honor and glory like those propaganda vids they show at the academy. What I'm about to tell you will crawl into your brain and live there forever." Lieutenant Kylo reached into his jacket and pulled out a small recording device, its blue light indicating it was ready to capture every word. He'd barely set it on the table when Vextar's massive clawed hand swept across the surface, sending the device flying into the nearest wall where it shattered into a dozen pieces. "No recordings," Vextar snarled, his voice dropping to a whisper that somehow seemed louder than a shout. "Some truths are too dangerous to preserve, too dangerous to let spread. The Coalition brass would have me skinned alive if they knew I was even talking about this." The lieutenant's eyes widened as he stared at the remains of his expensive equipment. "But, sir, I need documentation for my report. The people need to know what happened during the integration process." "The people?" Vextar's laugh was bitter as poison. "The people have no idea what integration really cost. They see humans walking around the core worlds now, working in their offices, serving on their ships, and they think it was all peaceful diplomacy and cultural exchange." He took a long pull from his bottle, the liquid burning down his throat like liquid fire. "They don't know about the screaming. They don't know about the nightmares that still wake me up every single night." The cantina had gone completely silent. Now, even the background hum of the station's life support seemed muted, as if the universe itself was holding its breath. "It started on Kepler Station 3 cycles ago," Vextar began, his six eyes growing distant as the memories came flooding back. Command told us we were dealing with another primitive species, just another backwater world that needed to be brought into the galactic community. Standard procedure: show up with overwhelming force, demonstrate our technological superiority, accept their surrender, and welcome them to civilization. His claws scraped against the table's surface, leaving deep gouges in the metal. We thought we were fighting another species like the Ventaxians or the Morphi, proud sure but ultimately reasonable, species that understood when they were outmatched. He looked up at the lieutenant, and for a moment his eyes held the depth of absolute terror. We were wrong. Dead wrong. Vextar's grip tightened around his bottle until the glass began to crack. The amber liquid inside trembled like his hands as the memories came flooding back. The cantina around them seemed to fade away, replaced by the cold metal corridors of Kepler Station and the smell of burning plasma. The siege was supposed to last 3 days, he began, his voice sounding like it was coming from somewhere far away. 3 days maximum. That's what Command told us when we dropped out of hyperspace above their little research station. We had 12 heavy cruisers, orbital bombardment platforms, enough firepower to glass a small moon. The humans had what looked like a mining operation and maybe 200 personnel. He paused to take another drink, the liquid burning away the taste of fear that always came with these memories. We had energy shields that could stop a supernova, plasma cannons that could cut through starship armor like paper, and sensor arrays that could track a fly across 3 star systems. The humans had creativity. The word came out like a curse loaded with more venom than any weapon in the galaxy. I was part of the third wave boarding party. My job was simple: secure the command center, process the surrender, and start the integration protocols. Standard procedure we'd done 100 times before on 100 different worlds. Vextar's 6 eyes began to glow with an inner light, the way Zolothian eyes did when reliving traumatic memories. But nothing about humans is standard. Lieutenant Kylo leaned forward in his chair, completely absorbed. Around them, other cantina patrons had stopped pretending not to listen. Even the 4-armed bartender had abandoned any pretense of working, his multiple eyes fixed on the scarred veteran. Their leader was a female named Da-Un, Vextar continued, his voice dropping to barely above a whisper. First time I saw her, I almost laughed. This tiny thing, maybe 5.5 feet tall, couldn't have weighed more than 120 pounds. She barely reached my chest, and I'm not even considered tall for my species. He set down his bottle with deliberate care, as if it might explode. But when she looked at you, the words died in his throat for a moment. I've stared into the hearts of dying stars, Lieutenant. I've seen black holes tear reality apart at the seams, but those eyes, those dark human eyes, held something that made my blood turn to ice water. They held the fury of a dying star compressed into something small enough to fit inside a skull. The lieutenant swallowed hard. What happened when you made contact? Contact? Vextar's laugh was sharp as broken glass. She was waiting for us in the command center when we breached the doors, just standing there, hands behind her back, like she was expecting dinner guests instead of an invasion force. My squad leader, Cathmore, started reading the standard surrender terms. Da-Un listened to the whole thing without blinking once. Vextar's claws began scraping against the table again, leaving deeper grooves in the metal. When Cathmore finished, she smiled. Not a friendly smile, Lieutenant. The kind of smile a predator gives its prey right before it strikes. Then she said something in her native language that our translators couldn't process. But her tone made it clear she was telling us exactly where we could stick our surrender terms. On the second day, the explosions started. The words came out in a rush, as if Vextar was trying to get them out before they could crawl back down his throat. First it was our supply depot in Sector 7, then the ammunition storage in Sector 12. Every few hours another explosion, another critical system turned into twisted metal and screaming soldiers. He took another long drink, the liquid sloshing as his hands shook. Medical equipment turned into fragmentation bombs, food synthesizers, rigged to spray superheated plasma instead of nutrients. Even the waste recyclers had been converted into some kind of chemical weapon that ate through our environmental suits. But how? Lieutenant Kylo asked, his voice tight with confusion. Your security sweeps should have detected any tampering. That's what we kept asking ourselves as our forces started disappearing one by one, Vextar replied, his voice growing darker. Turns out a male named Hyunwoo had been living in our base for almost a week before we even knew humans existed. On the station, he'd stolen maintenance gear from our own supply closets, learned our security protocols by watching our patrols, and basically made himself invisible. The veteran's 6 eyes began moving independently again, scanning the cantina, as if expecting attack from every direction. Hyunwoo moved through our base like a ghost. He knew our schedules better than we did, understood our technology better than our own engineers. While we were sleeping in our bunks, he was rewiring our equipment to kill us. The worst part was Ginny, Vextar continued, his voice now barely audible. Sweet little Ginny, who looked like she should have been teaching younglings instead of planning mass murder. She had turned the entire station's life support system into a weapon against us. Lieutenant Kylo's face had gone pale. The ventilation system. She pumped gases through the air recycling units that shouldn't have been lethal to our species. Our medical scanners said the air was fine, well within acceptable parameters for Zolothian physiology. But somehow, some way, those gases made our troops start hallucinating their worst fears. Vexitar's voice cracked slightly. I watched Sergeant Vexcole, a warrior who'd survived 3 different wars, start screaming about his dead clutchmates coming back to drag him into the void. Commander Theiss began firing his plasma rifle at shadows that weren't there, convinced that the walls were closing in to crush him. The cantina had gone so quiet that the hum of the station's power grid sounded like thunder. Every eye in the place was fixed on Vextar as he continued his tale of horror. By the 4th day, we weren't fighting soldiers anymore, he said, his voice carrying the weight of absolute certainty. We were fighting nightmares that had learned to use our own technology against us, nightmares that understood us better than we understood ourselves, nightmares that turned our greatest strengths into our deadliest weaknesses. Vextar stared into his drink for a long moment, as if gathering the strength to continue. The cantina around them seemed to hold its breath, waiting for the next chapter of horror. When he finally spoke again, his voice carried the weight of 1,000 nightmares. Kepler was just the beginning, he said, each word falling like a stone into still water. After what happened at the station, Command was furious. They'd lost face, lost credibility, and worst of all, they'd lost soldiers to what they still considered a primitive species, so they decided to make an example. The veteran's claws traced patterns in the condensation on his bottle, drawing shapes that looked disturbingly like grave markers. They chose the jungle moon of Verdania, perfect terrain for conventional warfare, they said, open spaces for our heavy equipment, clear sight lines for our energy weapons, and nowhere for the humans to hide their tricks. Lieutenant Kylo shifted in his seat, completely absorbed in the story despite the growing dread in his stomach. Command thought the jungle would be different. Different? Vextar's bitter laugh echoed through the cantina like a death rattle. They thought it would be easy, no space stations to sabotage, no complex technology to turn against us, just good old-fashioned ground combat, where superior numbers and firepower would decide the outcome. They assigned me to the 7th Assault Legion, 10,000 of the Coalition's finest warriors. He took another drink, the liquid burning away the taste of memories that refused to stay buried. I remember the briefing like it was yesterday. General Koran standing in front of that massive holographic display, pointing at topographical maps and talking about acceptable losses and swift victory. According to intelligence, there were maybe 300 human survivors scattered across the moon's surface, refugees from a failed colony ship, armed with primitive weapons and desperate enough to be dangerous. Vextar's 6 eyes began to glow with that familiar inner light, the physiological response his species had to extreme stress. We landed with enough firepower to level mountains, hover tanks, orbital strike capability, energy shields that could stop a meteor shower. The humans had trees and mud. The pause stretched out like a funeral shroud before he continued. Within a week, we'd lost half our numbers to ghosts. Ghosts? The lieutenant's voice cracked slightly. That's what we started calling them, Vextar replied, his voice dropping to barely above a whisper. Because that's what they were. Shadows that moved through the jungle like they were part of it, striking without warning and vanishing before we could respond. Our thermal scanners couldn't track them, our motion detectors couldn't find them, and our energy weapons couldn't hit what wasn't there. He leaned back in his chair, the metal groaning under his massive frame. The first sign something was wrong came on day 3. Patrol Gamma 7 was doing a routine sweep of the northern quadrant when Sergeant Thekaran brushed against what looked like an ordinary tree. The explosion took out half his squad and left a crater 20 feet wide. Lieutenant Kylo's eyes widened. The trees were rigged with explosives? Not rigged, Vextar corrected, his voice heavy with remembered horror. Grown that way. A human, named Donghyun, had somehow modified the local flora at a genetic level, turning the entire forest into a minefield. Some trees exploded when touched, others released clouds of spores that ate through our breathing filters, and a few actually moved to block our escape routes. The veteran's claws began scraping against the table again, leaving deeper grooves in the already scarred metal. But the trees were nothing compared to the rivers, beautiful crystal-clear streams that looked like paradise after hours of marching through humid jungle air. My soldiers were dying of thirst because our water purification systems kept breaking down mysteriously. What happened when they drank from the streams? The water had been poisoned with compounds that shouldn't exist in nature, Vextar said, his voice taking on the flat tone of someone recounting a nightmare. Not just any poison. Specifically designed compounds that ate through Zolothian armor from the inside out. Donghyun had somehow synthesized acids that targeted the molecular structure of our equipment while leaving organic tissue relatively unharmed. He shuddered, his purple scales rippling like water. I watched good soldiers dissolve inside their own protective gear, screaming as their armor became their tomb. And the worst part was knowing that somewhere in that green hell, a human was watching and taking notes on how well his creation worked. The cantina had gone so quiet that the sound of Lieutenant Kylo swallowing seemed to echo off the walls. You mentioned the wildlife was modified too. Modified doesn't begin to cover it, Vexitar replied, his 6 eyes beginning to move independently as the memories overwhelmed him. The indigenous creatures, things that should have been harmless herbivores, had somehow been trained to attack anything carrying our pheromone signature. Imagine being stalked by every living thing on an entire moon, from insects the size of your thumb to predators that could take down a hover tank. The veteran took another long drink, his hands shaking. Slightly, the humans had turned an entire ecosystem into a weapon aimed directly at us. Birds that dove at our communication arrays, small mammals that chewed through power cables. Even the plants seemed to grow in patterns designed to funnel us into killing zones. But the worst part, he continued, his voice dropping to a whisper, that somehow carried more impact than a shout, was Minho. Lieutenant Kylo leaned forward, afraid to speak and break the spell. Minho was their tracker, their scout, their angel of death rolled into one terrifying package, Vextar said, staring into the distance, as if he could still see the human moving through the jungle shadows. While we were struggling to adapt to an environment that wanted us dead, he had made himself part of it. Lived in the toxic swamps for months, let the acidic water and poisonous air change his body until he could move through areas that would kill us in minutes. The veteran's voice became strained, as if the words were being dragged out of him against his will. I saw him once, during a patrol in the eastern wetlands. Just a glimpse through the morning mist. But it was enough to haunt me forever. Half his face was melted from constant exposure to acid rain. His skin was mottled with chemical burns, and his left arm hung at an angle that suggested multiple broken bones that had never been properly set. But he was still fighting, Vextar continued, his voice filled with something that might have been admiration if it wasn't so terrified. Still killing my soldiers with nothing but sharpened metal and pure determination. He moved through that hellscape like it was his natural habitat, using the environment's hostility as camouflage and weapon both. The lieutenant sat in stunned silence, trying to process the image of a human so dedicated to warfare that he would poison his own body for tactical advantage. The silence that followed was so complete that it seemed to have physical weight, pressing down on everyone in the cantina, like the atmosphere of a gas giant. When Vextar finally spoke again, his words carried the absolute certainty of witnessed truth. That's when I understood that we weren't fighting a species that feared death. We were fighting a species that had weaponized death itself. The first pale rays of dawn began filtering through the station's massive viewport, casting long shadows across the cantina floor. The artificial sunrise painted everything in shades of gold and amber, but the beauty of it seemed somehow wrong after the horrors Vextar had described. Lieutenant Kylo realized he'd been sitting in the same position for hours, his muscles cramped and his mind reeling from everything he'd heard. Vextar sat back in his chair, the metal groaning under his massive frame. His 6 eyes had lost, their haunted glow replaced by something far worse, the hollow emptiness of someone who had seen too much and lived to tell about it. The bottle before him was nearly empty now, but the alcohol seemed to have had no effect on the veterans. Clarity of memory. "So there you have it, Lieutenant," Vextar said, his voice carrying a finality that seemed to echo through the slowly awakening station. "The complete and unvarnished truth about the human integration wars. We won every battle, every single engagement. Our casualty reports showed victory after victory. Our tactical analyses proved our superiority in every measurable category, and our propaganda broadcasts celebrated triumph after triumph." The veteran's claws traced one final pattern in the condensation on his bottle, this one looking disturbingly like a grave marker. "But we lost the war the moment we realized what we were fighting." Lieutenant Kylo found his voice, though it came out as barely more than a whisper. "How so? If you won every battle, how could you lose the war?" Vextar's bitter laugh was like the sound of metal tearing. "Because winning meant nothing to them, young one. Victory, defeat, survival, death, these concepts that drive every other species in the galaxy were just tools in their arsenal. They didn't fight wars to win territory or resources, or even to survive. They fought wars to make sure their enemies never wanted to fight them again." The veteran's eyes grew distant again, but this time with a different kind of memory. There was a human named Ji-Hoon. Captured him during a raid on one of their supply convoys. Small man, maybe 40 standard years old, with kind eyes and gentle. Hands that suggested he'd been a teacher or medic before the war. During interrogation, he was polite, even friendly. Answered our questions about troop movements and supply lines without hesitation. Vextar paused to finish his drink, draining the last drops of amber liquid. What we didn't know was that every answer he gave us was designed to lead us into a trap. While we thought we were extracting valuable intelligence, he was studying us, learning our procedures, our weaknesses, our blind spots. Lieutenant Kylo leaned forward, dreading what came next, but unable to stop listening. 3 days later, Ji-Hoon asked to speak with me privately, said he had important information about human command structures that he'd only share with a senior officer. When I entered his cell, he was sitting calmly on his bunk, hands folded in his lap like he was waiting for a friendly conversation. The veteran's voice took on that flat, traumatized tone again. He looked me straight in the eyes and said something I'll never forget. "Commander, I want you to understand that humans don't fight wars to win. We fight wars to make sure our enemies never want to fight us again. You've taught us who you are, and now we're going to teach you who we are." Vextar's 6 eyes began to glow with stress again. Before I could react, before I could call for guards or reach for my weapon, he smiled at me. Actually smiled. Then he activated a bomb he'd somehow constructed from components in his own body. Medical implants, artificial teeth, even the metal. Pins in his bones from old injuries. He'd turned his entire skeletal system into an explosive device. The cantina had gone completely silent again, every patron hanging on the veteran's words. The explosion killed Ji-Hoon instantly, of course, but it also killed 30 of my troops and destroyed half of our detention facility. As I lay there, in the wreckage, bleeding from a dozen wounds, I could swear I heard him laughing. Vextar's voice cracked. That's when I understood. We weren't fighting soldiers. We were fighting a concept of warfare that existed beyond our comprehension. Lieutenant Kylo sat in stunned silence, trying to process the image of someone turning their own body into a weapon. Vextar stood slowly, his massive frame unfolding like a mountain coming to life. He reached into his jacket and pulled out a small stack of credit chips, placing them on the table with deliberate care. The payment was far more than the drinks cost, but he seemed to want to leave something behind, some token of the weight his words had carried. "That's why Earth is now a full member of the Galactic Federation," he said, his voice carrying across the silent cantina like a funeral dirge. "Not because we respect their strength, or admire their courage, or value their contributions to galactic civilization. We gave them full membership because we're terrified of their weakness." The veteran began walking toward the cantina's exit, his gait uneven from old wounds that would never fully heal. "They've shown us that there's no limit to what they'll sacrifice to protect what they love. No line they won't cross, no price they won't pay, no horror they won't embrace if it means keeping their enemies away from their homes." Lieutenant Kylo watched the scarred warrior make his way through the maze of tables and chairs, leaving a trail of whispered conversations and frightened glances in his wake. "Every military operation now has human advisors," Vextar continued, his voice carrying despite the distance. "Not because they're the best tacticians or strategists in the galaxy, not because their technology is superior or their training is more advanced. We include humans in every military operation because just knowing they're involved makes entire fleets surrender rather than face what they might do." He paused at the cantina's entrance, his hand resting on the doorframe. Morning light streaming through the station's viewports, cast his shadow across the floor like a dark prophecy. The Krillian Dominion gave up a three-system territorial dispute rather than fight alongside humans. The Ventaxian Empire withdrew their claims to the Outer Rim colonies when they heard Earth was sending military advisors to help with negotiations. Even the machine worlds of the Synthetic Collective have started including humans in their peace treaties, not as signatories, but as witnesses. Lieutenant Kylo found himself standing as well, though he couldn't remember deciding to do so. But why, if they're so dangerous, why ally with them at all? Vextar turned back one final time, his 6 eyes reflecting the morning light like distant stars. "Because the alternative is worse, Lieutenant. Because now that we know what humans are capable of, we can never again make the mistake of treating them as enemies. They've shown us that there are fates worse than death, and they're willing to embrace every single one of them if it means protecting their own." The veteran's final words seemed to hang in the air like a curse. "Remember this, young one, and make sure you pass it on to every officer in the Coalition fleet. We may have superior technology that can reshape matter at the molecular level. We may have longer lives that span centuries instead of decades. We may have greater physical strength that can crush starship hulls with our bare hands." He paused, letting the weight of his words settle over the silent cantina like a burial shroud. "But humans have something we'll never understand. Something that defies every law of nature and civilization we thought we knew. They have the ability to turn their own mortality into the most terrifying weapon in the galaxy. They've made their weakness into our nightmare, and now we'll spend the rest of our lives making sure we never have to face it again." As the cantina door slid shut behind Vextar, the silence that followed was complete and absolute. "Lieutenant." Kylo stood frozen in place, staring at his untouched drink as the implications of everything he'd heard began to sink in. Around him, hardened criminals and battle-scarred mercenaries slowly began to disperse, each carrying with them a new understanding of why the mention of Earth made even veteran warriors shudder in fear. The young officer finally understood why. His assignment to document the human integration wars had been classified at the highest levels. Some truths were too dangerous to record, too terrifying to preserve, and too powerful to let spread unchecked through the galaxy. As the morning light grew stronger, Lieutenant Kylo quietly left the cantina, carrying with him the knowledge that humanity's greatest victory had been convincing the galaxy that their greatest weakness was actually their most devastating strength. The end.